today I want to read from page 372 with André Odendaal's Dear Comrade, President Oliver Tambo, and the founding of South Africa's Constitution. This is not, it's not your last book. Is it your last book?
2 books ago.
2 books ago, penultimate book. Me and those words. So page 372, because we're going to do this thing of, in general, the African National Congress, here standing in is Oliver Tambo and the founding of South Africa's Constitution. Because I think what you have here is an actually almost a century-old history of the origins of the ideas that many people think they are not ours. But in this book, 372, and afterward, Freedom and Bread, the book says it provides an explanatory framework for understanding how African agency shaped the transition from apartheid to self-determination and democracy. How the first steps in the making of the Constitution were taken, and what views underlay the template put in place. It argues that the decade-long process that started in the back rooms of Cha-Cha-Cha and Cairo Road in Lusaka was rich, complex, multidimensional, and ultimately inspiring. That the way in which South Africans constructed and formalized politically and legally a counter-hegemonic vision and a new constitutional order for South Africa is a remarkable story of African imagination, intellect, sacrifice, and struggle, and success, even political genius, against huge odds, including having to lose the suffocating systemic tentacles of 3 centuries of dispossession, and having to overcome superpower hostility. I'm reading this to announce where we are going, to announce what this whole conversation basically is about. I think it's summarized in this paragraph. Would you agree that this encapsulates what basically this book achieves?
That's right. I want to bring across that Africans won their freedom. They weren't given their freedom. And that struggle took place over more than 110 years before that happened. But we start in this book in the year after you were born, year before you were born.
Yes.
I found that this morning. And that was the Vaal uprisings.
Yes.
Close to in the space you were born as well, I think. And in that year, Black South Africans decided that they'd had enough with sham reforms of apartheid, the tricameral parliament. Botha promised reform, and yet again, Africans were left out of it. The National Party tried to co-opt a colored and Indian middle class, but kept excluding black people from any sense of real power or citizenship in their own country. And that was when the Vaal uprising started. And it was in 1985, it spread throughout the country. The apartheid government had to call a state of emergency, very repressive troops in the townships, and so on. And it was in July 1985 that there was a famous conference in Kabwe in Zambia, where the exiled ANC had gone into exile after the Sharpeville massacre in 1961 onwards, had gathered together for what they called a consultative conference, sort of how to do the final push to win freedom. And that was because the balance of power in South Africa had changed after Soweto 76, the rise of BC, the labor movement in the 70s, Mozambique and Angola becoming independent. There, with this tremendous struggle erupting in South Africa in 85, the balance of power swung towards the oppressed majority, effectively. And Botha promised to reform, and the famous Rubicon speech, where he failed to cross the river to deliver reform, meant that the international community deserted their loyalty and their friendship. The Western countries saw that they were backing the wrong horse. But the ANC's conference at Kabwe, 120 people from over 40 countries coming together to plan a final onslaught on apartheid. And in the wake of that conference, Oliver Tambo, the president of the ANC in exile, asked a young new member of the NEC, Palo Jordan, to write a position paper on what to do now with the West trying to influence, having influenced independence in Zambia, in Zimbabwe, and Namibian independence, trying to hold it up. The regime had forced Mozambique to back off through the Nkomati Accord. So at the time the struggle was at its highest in South Africa, there were also international dangers of outside forces trying to come in. And Tambo said, this is the time now for us to control our own future. What is the game plan that we're going to put in place for the future? And on the 8th of January 1986, at the annual speech of the president, where he laid out the strategies, he said, this is the year of the cadre. It's time to take the military struggle forward and the militant struggle inside South Africa. But on that very day, he formed a constitution committee, a secret committee of 6 or 7 intellectuals within the movement, to say at every war ends at the negotiation table. What are we going to be saying at that time? And it was a remarkable exercise that was unprecedented in the annals of the movement, the history of the movement, as he explained it. He wanted this group of intellectuals to work out a plan that the ANC would put forward for the future. And what emerged from that was a process that was quite remarkable. Within 10 days, they'd written a skeleton of what could become the template for a future constitution. By October 1986, they had turned that into the foundations of government document, which the NEC then studied in detail. By March 1988, it had become the guidelines for a democratic South Africa. And in August 88, the guidelines were accepted as the ANC's plan for the future. And this was a plan that surprised many people, and it shocked many people. Palo Jordan, writing after Kabwe, said, we must get rid of some of these holy cows of ours and the idea of a one-party state, for instance, and that we'll march into Pretoria. And it was an incredible speech, a paper that he wrote. He said there are three things that all the people who are saying there should be reform in South Africa are proposing or believe in. The one is that they say apartheid is a policy, not a system like we believe. So if you change the policy, apartheid's gone. That's how the white reform movement was trying to move away from apartheid without changing the essentials. Secondly, they all propose group solutions, federation, consociationalism, and so on. And that is in order not to change the basics of the system. And we must insist on a united South Africa, not a federal South Africa, because that would be reproducing racial privilege in a formalized way. So a united South Africa, and going with that, we must be open that we believe in a multi-party democracy and a Bill of Rights for all South Africans. That means that would be so radical that it would define our position apart from anyone in the South African political setup, and no one internationally would be able to object to that. In fact, it was the perfect way to say we want a united and a democratic South Africa with a constitution that has a Bill of Rights that makes sure that there will be radical transformation and individual freedom for every South African. It was a winning formula that they put in place, and they didn't change from that position at all for the next 10 years, 11 months, and 2 days, I think, after January the 8th. It was a consistent position that the ANC took up. It was also very stressful for the movement itself, because since 1960, it had been involved in armed struggle, and it was part of the anti-imperialist liberation movement struggles in Latin America, Vietnam, African decolonization, and so on, with very radical aims, which included even one-party states, a kind of Marxist doctrine, let's say the Soviet bloc kind of model, that where they had got support from. And the ANC also didn't want a liberal constitution that said it's a flat ground, everyone's now equal. It had to be a progressive constitution which made sure there was radical transformation of South African society, because apartheid is a system of exclusion and a system of marginalization and economic exploitation. And therefore, we want a constitutional democracy, yes, but it has to be a progressive constitutional democracy. And the key thing is going to be the balance of forces at the time that democracy comes to South Africa. So in other words, it's a struggle between reaction and the progressive forces and democratic forces that are trying to change South Africa. And so it was a very clear and simple articulation of what the ANC was putting to South Africans and to the world as the answer. Apartheid divides, as the UDF slogan said, and the progressive forces want to unite South Africans behind a set of values that are important, and that is basic democracy and a transformative constitution and future state. And then to get going with that adoption of the guidelines by 1988 was a diplomatic offensive. And that diplomatic offensive was based on uniting and being clear on the values. And a very important part of that was internally bringing about, taking away the boundaries that existed between exile and internal. It launched a diplomatic offensive, and although it was said to be a crime to speak to the ANC, if people left the country to speak to them, as we did in 1987 at Dakar, I was part of that historic moment where for more than 3 months, it was the main news item in South Africa, breaking the taboo about white South Africans speaking to the ANC, because the total onslaught slogans of the state said you're either with us or you belong to communism. And that's the same as what you're hearing from Marco Rubio today. It's the same mentality that governed South Africa. 500 years of colonialism, slavery, racism, and apartheid was the ugliest manifestation of that colonial era of Western expansion and capitalism. And so the opposite to that is we're going to divide, we're going to get people to unite behind an inclusive South Africa that fits with the spirit of the ANC has always been to unite. Its theory is all South Africans must be brought together and everyone must be citizens with the same rights. So that was a winning formula, and they then, in terms of what they put out into the public domain, that was something that no other political party in South Africa internally could challenge. You say you want democracy, you want reform. This is simple. Let's be democratic, united, and a constitution and a multi-party state. And so you had then a very important part of it was the uniting the struggle forces in South Africa as far as possible. Obviously, there were ideological divides, as we know, between Black consciousness, Pan-Africanist, Congress, and also other left groupings. And the idea was working from the ground, try and get all these local campaigns that are happening, the local struggles, and try and unite people in a sectoral way as well. Sports people must unite against apartheid. The National Association of Democratic Lawyers must be formed, and the National Education Crisis Committee. So to deepen that resistance and unity, to work in sectors, the musicians against apartheid and so on. So there was a whole structures and linkages. More than 200 meetings happened, which effectively broke the grip of the state to control contact with the exile movement. So it brought the internal and external forces together. More than 600 underground operatives also participating in the internal forces, so that there was a lot of communication between outside and inside. And linked to that also was the ANC had, by the 1980s, got offices in 44 countries in the world. They opened more offices in other countries than the state could have diplomatic presences, because apartheid was increasingly isolated. Internally, let us then isolate apartheid and increase the mass struggles. The 4 pillars of struggles were the armed struggle, mass mobilization, international solidarity, and the underground. So to this, you can say there was added a 5th one, and that is the idea of a constitutional outcome and a constitutional outcome that would, and negotiations. So this diplomatic offensive took place from the 1986 onwards, at the same time that people were writing the template for the future constitution. And by 1989, things were getting to the point where we've reached our rendezvous with history, Palo Jordan said. And this is the moment now where we have to have the power behind us to implement the vision we have. And that is when the Rari Declaration was drawn up to complement the guidelines, going through the President Kaunda of Zambia, Nyerere in Tanzania, the frontline states, then getting this document of the ANC signed off also by the Commonwealth countries, by the OAU, by the non-aligned movement of more than 100 countries, and then finally taking it to the United Nations. Inside South Africa, let's put pressure on the state, which has got its back to the wall now, by starting a defiance campaign where tens of thousands of people marched in to break state of emergency regulations. They invaded beaches that were for whites only, went to hospitals for treatment in white-only places, and so on. So by the end of 1989, and held a conference for a democratic future, where people from other ideological persuasions were also invited to come, and some did. And with that backing, the United Nations then gave the apartheid regime 6 months to change and adopt the demands of the Harare Declaration, or else face further sanctions. So basically, the mass pressure of the struggle, with a very clear strategic leadership, had pushed apartheid into a corner. It was the struggle and the African people who pushed the regime into that corner. It wasn't the clerk waking up on the 2nd of February
And feeling
1900
righteous,
feeling generous
noble.
and thinking this. It was something he had to do. To his credit, he did it, because we've seen what's happened in Gaza in the last 2 years. And P.W. Botha, when I grew up in the mid-80s, we never thought that things would change so quickly. We thought it was going to go on for a long time. The whites believed that they were indestructible, God was on their side, and they're not going to give up their power. So the way in which the ANC under Tambo strategically outmaneuvered the system was an incredible story when you think of it as a disparate movement of people in many countries over the world, with a small office in the back room of a shop in Lusaka, with all the assassinations that are happening in neighboring countries, Dulcie September in Paris and so on. The massive 30,000 people arrested in South Africa in 1987. And despite that censorship and control, the people persevered. The incredible courage, the strategic nuance, and it wasn't clever thinking. It was resistance grounded in 100 years of experience, lived experience of African people knowing that they were going to free themselves and they had to. So that's the first point I want to, the sort of summary I'd like to start with.
It's a very long one. Let me.
Sorry, yeah. I know it went on too long.
Yeah, no worries. What I do want to do is tease it a bit.
Yeah, no, sure. Let's go again.
And the first question is, surely Tambo, when in 85, Kwabe, Kabwe, I always can't get that name right, but when this initiative he takes that, look, let's draft, what would a new constitution look like? And you were explaining the hegemonic ideologies at the time, one-party state, vis-a-vis multi-party democracy, constitutional democracy. I want to take you through that, but when Tambo does that, my sense, and you cover it in some respects, there is an already existing intellectual value system he's plugging into that had been standing from here since 1923, so to speak.
Yeah.
I'd like you to do that sort of successive intellectual archive of documents of African people, which stem from 1923, 1943, 1955, as ultimately to this Harare Declaration.
So I
Just
think
plug it into the history of ideas of the ANC.
I think there are three very important things in looking at the background to that and how the final challenge to apartheid came from. The first was the deep African linkages that sustained the ANC in exile. The ANC was supported by Africa in a very, very big way, and internationally as well. And internationalism was in the DNA of the ANC from the earliest time. By 1900, 4 of the first 5 presidents of the ANC which was only formed in 1912, had already traveled overseas. So 300 young South Africans were studying in America in the first decade of the 1900s because educational opportunities were closing in South Africa and they were sent out to get that. So this engagement with the world had been there for a very long time. And these international ideas and developments from the start inspired Africans to become global citizens, shapers of a new society in South Africa. That was part of their engagement, was so that they could shape their future society. The idea of an inclusive South Africa where everyone could participate came already from the 1880s to the 1912s, before the ANC was formed. This country must be fair to people, and we want to have a greater role within the colonial society in future. And then from 1923, the first Bill of Rights is proclaimed by the ANC.
African Bill of Rights.
Yeah. But very importantly for me is the African Claims Document of 1943, which when Roosevelt and Churchill drew up the Atlantic Charter, which gave rise to the United Nations and the unilateral and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which Trump and them have now radically destabilized. Dr. Kluma set up a committee of 29 intellectuals, and under Z.K. Matthews, Professor Z.K. Matthews, and they said the Atlantic Charter, with all its nice work about universal human rights, must also apply to colonized people in the third world or the underdeveloped world or the global south as we talk today. And they laid it out. They want free education, the full property rights and all those very, very demanding, saying, okay, this is what you're saying after the fight against fascism. We want that in South Africa. And that marked the beginning of a new phase of struggle with the growth of the Youth League, amongst others, which said we're now going to fight for our freedom and win our national sovereignty back. And the Freedom Charter in 1955 with Professor Matthews, again very important, in proposing that at Komani in 1953 or 54, set out the kind of draft of the kind of South Africa that the struggle wanted to see, the ANC and its allies. So there was a constitution, a vision for the future. And when Tambo sat at the first meeting with his constitutional committee, he said, we must start by reading the Freedom Charter paragraph by paragraph. It can't be a constitution, but the constitution must guide us into the future. So the ANC was feeding back into a constitutional tradition going back more than 100 years that had been ruptured by its being forced into illegality and exile and starting the armed struggle. It was now saying we've got to revert back to constitutionalism and the diplomatic offensive of negotiations, so that when all wars end at the negotiating table, when we sit down one day, we must be ready, and what are we going to say? And that's where the constitutional guidelines.
So the concept of the Bill of Rights, by now, is of Africans' Bill of Rights. By now is over 100 years if the date of its first drafting is 1923. By 2023, it actually was the centenary. And African claims documents
in 1943.
1943.
83 years ago.
83 years.
So,
and 55, which is the Freedom Charter, would have been 70 years already. That was, I mean, nobody talks about the first two anymore. But I think, Prof, it's instructive. I mean, let us say what were the major ideas, because you see, this ANC of 23, this ANC of 43 is the ANC that doesn't have in its membership white people. It's Africans on their own. It's an
Until
ANC that doesn't have
1985.
Indian people. It's an ANC. Maybe 55 was the first sort of freedom chart, hence that particular significance was really drafted in many ways than one of the early outcomes of a non-racial community. But the first two are constitutive of an ANC that is just African, so that what you're about to take us through the major ideas of the Africans claims document. These are just Africans. The 29 member committee that is drafting is just Africans.
And this is why we need to know our history today. Because when we were at the heart of the exile struggle, armed struggle, and very militant anti-imperialism, we saw all those previous generations as kind of Uncle Toms. But they laid the foundations for this vision of an inclusive South Africa to be developed. And in 86, it became the turn to bring that back into the picture. And that took some time and some complexity, let's say, because the focus was on, armed struggle and not doing, as the prime kind of, it was always armed struggle was part of the political struggle, but the notion of armed struggle was so strong that to talk about negotiations at that time was very difficult. So it took tremendous insight at that time to actually say, the time is going to come where we are going to have to negotiate and we have to put the plan on the table. We can't arrive at the table and think what happens now. Zimbabwe in 1980 and Namibia with Resolution 435 was being promised independence, Namibia, and it took 10 years for it to get there. And they said, we can't be held by the international community who are supporting the system indirectly, the Western countries, into an open-ended thing that leads nowhere. We have to say this is what we believe. And behind that, we have to have the mass struggle to give us movement on the ground and fight through these multiple things.
This mass aspect is like the most repeated, that there was a mass struggle, struggle. It's something about 80, this process that you set out that I'd like you to, again, patiently detailed, is the ANC basically consulting the whole world. Tambo sets up this people, 6-member committee. They draft something. It develops into a document which got heavily consulted across the world. I want you to take us through that in a bit of a patient detail, the inputs of key, which countries, which leaders, which conferences, so as to make this point that South Africa's constitution, actually there's no other constitution like that in the world. If you think of
and we see
the
it
Americans
today.
and the French revolutions, the Haitian revolution, because South Africa was such, the anti-apartheid struggle was such an international movement. Oliver Tambo set it as a rule that you've got to go and consult with the rest of all those activists about a South Africa they want to see. Just take us through that. These chaps were very serious people.
How you could consolidate with the dangers of exile. Palo Jordan, who was a key part of the NEC working on this plan, was in the same room as Ruth First when she was blown up and killed. He had his eardrum burst and he was in hospital for 2 weeks. And Robert Davis has written in his autobiography about how he accompanied Samora Machel into the room, and the sight of what met him has still not left him. These are the dangers that people went through on a daily basis in exile. The lack of money, the lack of resources. But there's a photograph that we put in the book of Miriam Makeba singing in this majestic kind of style that she's got and beauty. And there's a guy playing in the piano with a handkerchief in his top pocket, and that's President Kenneth Kaunda. Now that tells you something about the linkages and alliances that Tambo developed with other African leaders, particularly from Tanzania, Zambia, Angola, Mozambique, and so on. He was called a brother president by them. And the fact that the ANC was located in Lusaka as its headquarters for so long. There was the Harare meeting, very important, in 1986 or 87, the Harare Conference for Children, where the internal groups found an opportunity to meet with the entire leadership of the ANC. That was one of the key conferences of those 200 meetings that started happening across borders. And the Zimbabwe government made that possible, and also Zimbabwean academics were doing research and visiting South Africa to help develop ideas around the future as well. So the linkages in all these countries, also with the Swedes, who were very supportive, with the PASA project to look at future scenarios for Southern Africa to help the ANC work that out. So let me just read to you Oliver Tambo's first trip after he landed in Tanzania for the first time. And it was to Tunis via Nairobi and Rome. And Luli Kalinikos, his biographer, recalls the impact. For the first time in his life, Tambo was exposed to the sheer cosmopolitanism of Africa. Yea, in the north, ebony, blue-black men spoke fluent French and Italian, yet wore the dress of vibrant textiles, design, color, and stitchwork. Colonized as most unmistakably were, they were also located in a nexus where Africa met the Mediterranean and the Levant, the cultural product of centuries of vigorous trade, war, and religious transaction. And it was a culture shock that made him realize the challenges ahead. He had now to construct his identity in a world of new diversity. He was an Anglican guy who wanted to become a church minister, and he was a mathematician and a lawyer, and now he had to go and become a cosmopolitan in the world to meet that struggle. And there's a beautiful description of when he's told he has to leave now to go and lead the outside, set up bases on the outside. He goes back to his office for 2 days and finishes all his paperwork and casework. That's the diligence. He takes his wife Adelaide and they sit next to in a park, and he explains to her he's got to leave tomorrow night. And these are the radical impacts on people's lives. And there he goes, and from there it's to Tunis and Rome and a never-ending stream of global engagements. That's what finally led to his health packing in his schedule. So that connection globally with Pan-Africanism that comes far back as well. And in Exile in Ghana, when the first, often Nkrumah and Ghana's independence, South Africans were there. Barbara Masakela met Maya Angelou there. Miriam Makeba was married to Stokely Carmichael. I mean, it wasn't just people meeting diplomatically to make connections. It was on the cultural level, on the intellectual level, in all sorts of ways.
And on a romantic level.
Romantic, because culture and music lay at the heart of the inspiration of the political vision. And that's what made the 80s so powerful. And why the funeral on the sports field with the singing and the dancing became a symbol of that determination not to step back again.
I see. I mean, that's the normal. I think everybody is aware of just how the struggle was multinational, international. But the genius of this document cannot end in a National Executive Committee meeting. All these people who are supporting the South African struggle must be consulted.
Yeah.
And their views must be taken into consideration. Again, I think maybe just give us that. I mean, who were the major international figures on the one hand, but other forums on the global stage, such that by the time South Africa opens itself up to negotiations with the unbanning of political parties, essentially what the ANC is armed with is an international consensus that the apartheid regime doesn't have.
The apartheid, it showed the total isolation of the regime at that stage. Besides the political pressures, it realized it couldn't stay in power through repression for much longer. It could maybe have stayed for 15 more years. And as we say, compare Israel and Palestine, the scenarios. But they were so isolated, and the strategic alliance was so complete to go from the frontline states to the OAU, to the Commonwealth, to the
These are all places
non-aligned
that they
movement.
consulted.
They all went to those meetings. More than 100 states say we support the constitutional guidelines and the Harare Declaration as the future for South Africa. It was tied up in a nice package and said, it's simple. We need democracy in South Africa, and we are proposing an inclusive and generous democracy. And so, you know, there are two myths that we must get out of the way.
Yeah.
The first one is that somehow it was the Russians or the British or the Americans that laid the table for it, that helped us get that. In October 1986, when the Foundations of Government document, which was the early draft of the constitutional guidelines, was more or less agreed to by the NEC. That was 1 month before Tambo and Mbeki met with Gorbachev for the first time. So they had decided on African soil, led by Zola Square as one of the key people who'd been the ANC's ambassador at the OAU beforehand, had decided on that strategy before they met Gorbachev. And it was 3 years before the fall of the wall. So it was not when the wall fell that suddenly the ANC changed. The plan was in place at the very time that the wall was falling. And at the same time that people were pouring into the streets in Eastern Europe and Tiananmen Square, the Defiance campaign was also falling into the streets in December, November, October 1989 in South Africa. So that's the first thing. The British, Margaret Thatcher said the ANC is living in cloud cuckoo land if they think they'll ever rule South Africa. And that was in the middle to late 80s. George Shultz and the USA didn't want to meet with Tambo because they were terrorists. And only that happened in 1987 when this balance of forces, when this change in power started becoming evident. And when you look at it today, you don't get any sense somehow that that struggle operated in that very calculated way and developed in that way. It's almost like the massive sacrifices, the massive vision, and the huge effort that went into it, and the diplomacy on a wide level that outmaneuvered the state is not appreciated today, I must say. And one can understand it given where we are today. But, you know, for anyone, if you're talking about decolonization, you have to know who our African forefathers were intellectually and politically. And in the 80s, was a key moment.
I do want to pick up some few aspects and ask some controversial questions that are relevant to today. But before that, I want to read the guidelines. I always struggle. I've got the Harare Declaration in the book. So guidelines would be Quito Carnival, Meda in Paris. 285, I think.
Yeah. It's quite
Just to
it's
say,
it's quite long, you know.
yeah,
but
well, I'll pick up a few.
Yeah.
I mean, I think so people get a sense of what these chaps wrote. And please keep in mind, my question is going to be about this idea of a multi-party democracy and then constitutional democracy. Just the ideas, why and how such decisions were made. What were the debates really about what do we become, a one-party state, a multi-party state, and how does the party decide we must become a multi-party democracy and why? Because these are, and the constitutional question, I mean, the question of there must be a constitutional court and we must have constitutional supremacy. What was the alternative? It almost looks so natural because constitutional supremacy, by definition, one almost confuses it as rule of law, that, you know, everybody is equal before the law. Such a law must be there. But it seems that there were alternatives that we hear now today being expressed in other circles, such as parliamentary democracy. In some instances, some people want the revival of some feudal constitutional or feudal state arrangements.
And if you read the 1986 NEC discussions about that, I mean, it was a very strong thing against traditional leaders being leaders in the new democracy, because that was like, would be an encouraging, continuation of feudal relations and so on. And only one person opposed it or felt strongly that the traditional leaders were important. Others said it's a political issue that you're going to divide people at a time when you're trying to unite them. But the supremacy of a modern constitution would be those relations would fall under that in future, but it's not something you now want to tackle and start internal debates all over South Africa.
Okay, I can't find the actual guidelines, but just to take some beats from the Harare Declaration, Statement of
They
Principles.
included.
Yes, I know it's in here.
Yeah.
But there's some interesting sections. We believe in a section they call Statement of Principles, which is really, in my view, the heart, because between the preamble, climate for negotiations, guideline process, as well as a program of action. This is the declaration in Harare. But the Statement of Principles has the following. We are at one with them that the outcome of such a process should be a new constitutional order based on the following principles, among others. South Africa shall become a united, democratic, non-racial state. All its people will enjoy common and equal citizenship and nationality regardless of race, color, sex, and creed. All its people shall have the right to participate in the government and administration on the basis of universal suffrage, exercised through one person, one vote, under a common voters' roll. All shall have the right to form and join any political party of their choice, provided that this is not in the furtherance of racism. One makes you think of some political parties.
Exactly. And if you look at the group rights where Jordan
Yes.
said no group rights, and you look at AfriForum today with their reactionary
Yes. They are
international
in pursuit
partners.
of group rights.
Yeah. But is that not clear and simple in terms of whoever reads it knows exactly what the struggle is ultimately about? Whereas reform is always conditional and yes, but, and we are trying to change while the system stays intact. It was a beautifully crafted, simple kind of thing to put out there in the country.
I do want to read a little bit of all of these,
Yeah,
not the rest of
sure.
them, just these sort of sections.
Yeah.
All shall have the right, all shall enjoy universal recognized human rights, freedoms and civil liberties protected under an entrenched Bill of Rights. And we know the ANC has had a Bill of Rights since 1923. South Africa shall have a new legal system which shall guarantee equality before the law. South Africa shall have an independent and non-racial judiciary. The independence of a judiciary is not something that is an outcome of negotiations, precedes negotiations. Is there in the ANC.
No,
they don't get it as an outcome of the
yeah,
negotiations, some compromise, as it were. An independent judiciary is an ANC idea,
in
and which
the 1980s,
already.
not after 19.
There shall be an economic order which shall promote and advance the well-being of all South Africans. A democratic South Africa shall respect rights, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of all countries and pursue the policy of peace, friendship, and mutual beneficial cooperation with all people.
And that also goes with the ICJ and multilateralism and so on.
The United Nations.
It's part of international solidarity over the century, basically.
And they then say, for any negotiations to take place, the following must happen. You must release all prisoners. Anyway, let me then probe. Take us, maybe as a final conceptual work now. Firstly, the idea then of a multi-party democracy. How did that debate unfold? Do we go for, typical one-party states? There were many of them. Nyerere was presiding over a one-party state at the time. I think Kaunda as well. There were many of them, particularly
Mozambique as well.
Mozambique was a one-party state. How does the ANC, under those circumstances, see multi-party democracy as a solution when majority of the progressive countries, so to speak, were entrenched in one-party states?
Because the weaknesses of the one-party model were by then becoming evident. So when the guys went into Mozambique soon after independence in the 1970s, the first thing they saw was a Frelimo soldier carrying a real AK-47, and they had the sense of freedom has been achieved here. 1987, when they flew from Maputo to Lusaka for the meetings of the Constitutional Committee, that soldier was no longer that symbol exactly of what he'd been 10 years ago. Centralized government over the people was also suppressing kind of energies on the ground, let's say. So that centralized model was not working in Angola. It was not working in Mozambique. It was in trouble in Zambia. KK was in the 90s kicked out. And so people were grating against, to be honest. I think from what I've heard from the interviews and, experiences I've heard, that people were seeing also going to the GDR to study.
What is the GDR?
The German Democratic Republic, the old East Germany.
Yes.
So many people studied there, and many people came back.
What was the worry? Because when you think sitting here today, the regimes of the East, East Asia, held on to the model. And they managed to
Yeah.
sort of disarticulate a developmental strategy that has seen them become part of the developed countries. All of them, well, not all, but most of them are one-party states. They were able to, constitute an economic program, suppress corruption, educate their societies, lead an industrial strategy, and limited a democratic internal contestation to the party.
Yeah. I think that's a debate for post-1990 in a way. At that stage, it was to say, the state's propaganda is that these are godless communists who are intent on taking over our country, imposing a one-party state and everything that is anti-democratic. And this model of democracy and the ideas of the Freedom Charter actually were not antithetical to multi-partyism.
Democracy.
And that was Tambo's leadership that came through at that moment. He was a guy who always listened, spoke last, as you had in your last podcast, very precise in the way he operated and in the use of his language and so on. And post-Kabwe, that was probably one of the most strategically decisive interventions when he said, I want a multi-party democracy and a Bill of Rights. That is what I support. And that it sort of almost fitted in maybe, with the colonial British American kind of models at that time, or being models. But this was an African solution. It was anti-imperialist at heart. People traveled to Vietnam while the war was still on. They supported Vietnam. They supported Palestine. Alex Laguma in this book in 1980. They were deeply anti-imperialist. And he also said at that first meeting that the West is not our friends. We have to come up here with a solution that is strong enough to withhold the pressure they're going to put on us, as they'd done in Lusaka and the British had done in Zimbabwe.
Let's go to this question of independent judiciary, but in the main, that concept of the constitutional court as the final arbiter on constitutional disputes, which today seems to unsettle people who were in that room in Kabwe.
Well,
they
I
seem
don't
to
think
now think it was a wrong. It was a, but how did that one in particular unfold the idea of the supremacy of the Constitution and a constitutional court, which becomes the final arbiter?
Well, I think the idea of the Constituent Assembly was absolutely crucial, that the Constitution would only be adopted when by the elected representatives of the South African people.
Agree.
They did not go there with saying this is what the Constitutional Court will look like. It was the idea of a constitutional democracy which would be finalized by the representatives of the people, chosen by the people in a universal adult vote. So that by 89, when this book ends, that's an issue that's still coming. And how it gets developed is by those representatives of the people chosen in 1984. And that was a part of the ANC preempting, imposing something on South Africa, saying it must be the elected representatives of the people who finalize the Constitution.
But already in its doctrine, you can see the principle is the same. Independent judiciary.
Yeah, if you look at the African claims and so on, you'll probably there. Find things there. Yeah.
What does that mean?
Yeah.
What did it mean in your view? I mean, of course, I get this idea that the final constitution itself but the principle that there must be in that constitution, we as the ANC are proposing that in that constitution, there must be an independent judiciary, independent of the politicians that are going to decide on its independence.
I think,
But also, there is something powerful there, isn't it? I mean, of constitutional supremacy.
I think
This idea is not the result of the Constituent Assembly, the constitutional supremacy concept. And you can tell me otherwise, but the idea that the Constitution is once adopted will be a supreme law, will be something that we all nonetheless henceforth, and you make it eternally difficult to amend. But this is contested today.
No, that's true. And the idea of, sort of the sovereignty of Parliament
vis-a-vis
the law. But I think again, I don't have the answers. There are other people who are much more knowledgeable than me about this. But the context in which African independence happened and in which what we're seeing being dismantled today were very powerful things. The United Nations was going to become a parliament of the world where people would solve problems together, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And, so it comes from that kind of tradition as well. Africans buying into this this vision of a global solidarity in future and a rules-based kind of order, rather than the Soviet model of that existed during the Cold War, and that's what led to quite a lot.
What do you think Oliver would say, OR,
Yeah.
to the debate today, that the problem is you've got 12 individuals who sit in Hillbrow, was it Braamfontein?
Yeah.
Very close to Hillbrow, but
Yeah.
who sit in Braamfontein. The idea is that these are the people who decide and they are not elected. What would Oliver Tambo think of that argument?
You're asking me to be speculative.
Of course, I
Basically,
mean,
he was
what else
he
would
was
I?
a lawyer, and he was precise in his articulation, and that articulation that you've just read is a beautiful and powerful one, and it's totally African in its origins. I think for me, it's time for a second transition in South Africa. No one can be happy with where we're at. It's not necessarily the fault of the Constitution. The 30 years later, we can't keep on standing by, 94 in the Constitution. Why are there so many people excluded socio-economically? Both Kada Asmal and Penuel Maduna said that this is not just a constitution to bring in human rights. This had to be a bread and freedom constitution. It had to be a radical transformative constitution, given 300 years of structural disablement that had happened in South Africa. So that when the guys arrived back in South Africa in 1990, they had very radical plans in terms of how they saw the Constitution. But they also saw the problems very clearly about the people's representatives being a trade union, this and the other in a one-party state constitution. Because as we know, the people, in the name of the people weren't there. And in many ways. So it's a complex debate if you go to Asia and stuff as well now. But I think the idea was, perhaps like Nkrumah, too much once we've got political power. And but the idea of the democracy they wanted to bring into existence was very clearly laid out. Tambo also died at the wrong time. I mean, he literally dotted the last I and crossed the last T and collapsed that day or the next day. And his presence was tremendously missed between, when was it that he had the stroke? Was it August 89 and 1991 when the negotiations started? So the internal kind of differences of opinion within the ANC, there's no one who comes straight out as the leader. Alfred Nzo and the Treasurer General Nkobi weren't exactly the statesman mold. They were more solid people in the background. And it's only when Madiba arrives in Lusaka in February 1990 that you then have him clearly now going to become the new guy, and he links up with Tambo, but he's effectively, Tambo has now been removed from this thing. I think if Tambo had been in South Africa from 1990 to 1994, we might have had a less generous sort of offering, let's say, from the liberation movement.
I want to come back to that part, and it relates to the point you made about the debates at the time or over apartheid being a system versus apartheid being a policy, but also the group thinking that some people had hoped, certainly some in the sections of the Black community did see the continuation of reforms alongside race and ethnicity. The Bantu stand leaders, for instance, that sort of continuation of you can continue to reform South Africa and have it exist on the basis of groups that are racial but also that are ethnic. I found the guidelines.
Okay.
Yes. And some important things here where they talk about the new constitution shall be based on the following principles. Somewhere they say here, the state and all institutions shall take active steps to redress as speedily as possible the economic and social inequalities produced by apartheid, in particular the unjust dispossession of the African people of their land shall be corrected through the abolition of all legislation restricting land ownership and use on racial basis and all other apartheid measures designed to deprive the people of their land and livestock. The victims of forced removals carried out by the apartheid regime shall be given proper redress by the state. In particular, they shall be given the right to return to their land and ancestral homes wherever possible.
Well,
I mean,
if you look,
these chaps didn't just think of the right to vote, the right to form a party of your own. There's also a commitment to a very
radical transformation.
because, but this describes the apartheid systematically, because apartheid was first and foremost
absolutely
a spatial development on the basis of race and ethnicity, as you say. So take me through, in the very, very final end of the what became the South African Constitution, do you see a framework lying in there, allowing for systemic disarticulation at that level?
Well, there was an article last year about the land claims in KZN, the area around Michael House, I remember particularly being mentioned. Something like 117,000 land claims, of which the files had been lost. And only one land settlement in which the white farmer who owned a game reserve, I think, got 700 million rand. Now, is that the Constitution's fault that all those cases were not dealt with? District 6 today, if you see this empty sky in Cape Town and how slow that process has been, it's not because of a lack of will to redress, but what has happened in the 30 years since then. And that's why I think the debate about a second transition becomes very crucial in this stage. But let us look at actually the heroic nature in which freedom came to South Africa. It wasn't given, it was fought in that incredible way in the 80s with those goals that are articulated there. What went wrong from then to now is a question we must be totally open-ended about. But I think at a time of genocide, of the collapse of Western civilization, actually, if you look at their behavior in Gaza and, in a film genocide that's enabled by the West, the notion of human rights totally gone. Let's not forget the value of this vision that those people left us and brought to our democracy. So that international law is domesticated in our law, unlike other countries where might is right. They'll claim they've got a rule of law system and democracy, but then go and invade perpetually in a serial way countries and break up Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, Syria, and everywhere else to control oil fields and geopolitical dominance. So this was a democracy, as you saw there, coming out of an international supported struggle that placed South Africa in an international way of behaving and internally as well. And at this time, for me, one of the big lessons is remember, I read this sort of thing recently, remember, resist, and find our voice again, articulate with an African voice from the global south. We've got to lead in a time of systemic sort of crisis, climate crisis, survival, and everything else, reinvent the notion of human rights. And it's about an us and them attitude and an inclusive us. We are part of the world is where decoloniality comes, because the whole Western dominance of the last 500 years comes from us and the othering of the other, us and them. And it's come up starkly again, which shows you, again, the achievement of actually forcing the regime, within 10 years of Kabwe, the regime that was confident that it will hold the communist threat was no longer. So the achievement was immense. The challenges today are immense. And I think that as young people who want change, who want decolonization, let us go back to these thinkers. Let's go back and understand their context, and let us fight for that inclusive, universal vision of a future, not only for our country, but the world. And one of the beauties of knowing of sort of exploring the history since 1880 is that the notions of Black consciousness, non-racialism, and Pan-Africanism, for me, have been grappled with since the 1880s.
Yes, absolutely, I agree.
Since the formation of the Ethiopian churches, and they vacillate as the country comes under pressure in different ways, where the pendulum swings one way and the other. But all of them, at their heart, are about an inclusive humanity. And that to me is very important.
Let me ask the final question to underscore this group's the desire of the chaps that were running apartheid to try and sneak in the constitution sections that may allow them to continue alongside group existence. But anyway, remember the paper we started with by Palo Jordan to the NEC. If you remember its title, it was The New Phase of Counter-Revolution. This is back in ANC lexicon. What is the face of counter-revolution today? If you are Jordan and you were to advise the NEC, and the paper you write here, it notes the ethic and the rumors and speculation about the possibilities of some dramatic reform breakthrough in South Africa. The problem was that most of these were rehashed versions of old themes. That was not to say that no change was happening. Indeed, he wrote, the very outpouring of speculative writings and premature predictions is a sign of the extreme fluidity of the situation. And he was trying to attack the idea of a false reform, a false change. Counter-revolution always wants to give us a half-baked, to postpone or to extend its lifespan. It gives us a half-baked solution so it can repackage itself. Now, earlier when you were talking about this idea of the continuation of group reform, group thinking, you mentioned AfriForum. But isn't it true that there are about 40 or so % of the white section of the population that didn't want a negotiated, open, democratic transition to take place if we go with the referendum that declared ground?
Yeah.
But also we know that there are chaps who in 1994 said, you may have won the battle, but we will win the war.
I totally disagree with the president and his long elaboration of somehow or other the old state infiltrating us and stopping democracy. I think we've got to look at our own faults, that the best way to work against counter-revolution is to be a strong, efficient, delivering state that lives according to the values that it put into existence. And in the absence of that, you have these vacuums in which everything flows in. And in a time of change that we're going through now, where reaction is sweeping across the globe, we need to be even stronger. Now we're at our weakest with potholes and no water and 25 municipalities that pass their audits, and that's what allows counter-revolution to come in. The other massive factor for me is that the white community has not bought into democracy. It still talks about they and them. It still talks about somehow or other being victims when, the victims of apartheid have become the problems again to the white community in many ways. Unfortunately, the kind of parody of the liberation ethic that we see today as government and the ANC. And I'm sympathetic to the goals and the aims, but what I see there, and my children says, Dad, what's happening here? What are these goals? But the white South Africans have benefited from democracy, as was stated there. Afrikaners are wealthier than they were. The black body is still the body that gets shot in the street, that dies in poverty and stuff like that. And that's not because of counter-revolution. It's because of us not building this democracy to the capacity that it should have, so that the values have meaning. You can't talk about, justice for everyone when there's a justice system in dysfunction. We have to revisit where we've come from. We've got to fix what's wrong and still hold on to this sense of us as South Africans. It's also when the trouble is all over the show, it's very easy to divide and rule. And I don't see any mastermind from the old system. If anything, they totally overrated themselves, just like the Stasi did in the GDR. Barnard and Esterhazy almost claim to be the people who co-authored democracy. They came in very late. They overstated their power. Palo Jordan knew that Francis Melly was working with a system when Dakar happened, and he said, how come he's there when we've decided not to put him into certain sensitive places? And when, you know, all these authoritarian states have these great claims and then collapse. But clearly the radical transformation on many levels that we wanted, I'm interested in sport, and one can look all over, but the socio-economic conditions is governed, I would say, by global economy, which makes it
How
very
could you not
difficult.
see value in this idea? Because I find some
But are you
actions very strange. I'll put it to you this way.
Yeah.
How is it that people who were in Kabwe,
In Kabwe.
in 1985
Yeah.
are the ones, after having run the state,
But who are these people?
after having run it down, how come those people today tell us there's a problem with the constitution?
Yes, no, and that.
So these are characters who were in Kwabe.
Yeah.
And I remind you of the paper that Jordan writes. If you read, because I had to go read it on its own. If you read that paper, how could you not, from its framing of questions, not wonder, how do people who are in the room in Kwabe, who come up with the principles and the guidelines for what became South Africa's constitution, and they win on all of them, mobilize the rest of the world, get the world behind those principles, and when they come in 1990, they come with a document which is almost like an internationally approved constitution. And in the main by progressive forces.
Yes.
Fidel Castro,
No, completely.
KK, Nyerere, Gorbachev, and many
The whole world.
progressive,
The
the
whole
whole world.
The whole of organized
radicals, from
Yeah.
I mean, these people had gone through and said, this is the best.
The word is
And all of
the
that.
whole of organized humanity.
The whole of organized humanity. The people that were in that room, who did all of this?
No, they didn't do all of that.
No, I'm saying they were there.
Yeah.
They are part of the processes from Kwabe up to the negotiation in Kodesa 1 and Kodesa 2. Not only do they do that, they run the state in the name of this constitution. 30 years later, they say no. They say no. The problem is the constitution. The constitution doesn't allow us to give you land. The constitution doesn't allow us to give you the mines. The constitution doesn't allow us to give you jobs. In fact, in the end, these people who are sitting in Braamfontein are not elected. We should take the final word back to Cape Town. They tear it apart.
But if
so
you're
so
talking,
how do you explain that except
but it's not
the concept of counter?
No. There are two things here. Firstly, Zola Skweyiya became chairman of the Constitution Committee. He was the Minister of Social Welfare who started the 50 million people on state grants. That is a quiet soldier for freedom, working very hard. That's a key note of his thing, the diligence of their work, being sent to Swaziland to fetch Katsesmarker's body, with the security police crawling out there, having just assassinated people. Those are the things that these guys went through in drafting, while they were drafting this constitution. And I remember him telling me, this is no longer my ANC, the guy who drafted the constitution. And he said, when Teddy Pekane died of the Constitution Committee, he wasn't even shown on SABC, his funeral. And he said, we've got to write our story in concrete, not in sand like it is now. State capture was not... state capture and the Zuma era, it's obvious. It's total destruction of institutions that are supposed to monitor and make the system work. And that's where we're sitting today with Madlanga, from the deliberate breakdown. But this is not a counter-revolutionary working for the apartheid state. This is a corrupt person who, under his watch, broke down the liberation legacy and made a mockery of it. And we have now got to do that second transition to get back to the values and the heights of what these people represented to us. But it's for a new generation to do it. When Jaitu Jabavu started Imvo Zabansundu in 1884, he was 23 years old, the first independent black newspaper in South Africa. Those were the digital natives of the 1800s. They had to learn new technologies, new worlds, engage in new ways of lobbying and petitioning and so on. And they did it with skill. Now it's for the young generation to pick up within their experience, but not to cut themselves off from what went before. Cut yourself off from state capture and other things, but find a way forward that draws on this legacy, because what is the opposite? It's Trump and the noises of the social digital age and the kind of ussing and theming of people. Progressiveness is something located within the heart of the African struggle in South Africa, and we must find that somehow and give it a new expression in this new era.
Thank you so much, André.